Hey guys, I know it's been a minute, but finally getting back to my least favorite job, building a quad, and that's the brakes, bleeding the brakes especially. So let's talk brakes. You've got two options. You've got standard T-line, where you have a single coming down from the master and then splits off to your two sides, or you've got the option of using a double banjo bolt and running dual lines. Recreational riding, dune riding, most of the time, you're fine with the T-line. Most people if you're going to race, you run the dual lines because there's more fluid in there, and more fluid takes longer to heat up. The more you use your brakes, the more it heats up, and then you start to get brake fade. So motocross guys, I would say probably most of those are going to use a dual brake line because they're constantly on their front brakes, with the tight track, cornering hard. I like the dual brake line because I do a variety of riding. I may do some MX. Even in works, we have tight tracks. So it's just kind of some added, security. Your brakes won't fade as quickly. Either one is fine. I always recommend going with stainless lines, streamline, Galfer. I pretty much run streamline on everything just because Galfer gets a bit pricey and harder to find. A lot of times you have to order through them. So, as far as bleeding, you have two options for bleeding as well. You've got your standard, little container, little end, you put it in there, you pour fluid in, you pump the brake over and over and over. Tight, lock the nut off, keep doing it. That's a pain, especially with dual brake lines. It's a pain, honestly, with even T-lines. So what I use is a pressure bleeder, and there's different ones out there. This one is just from Harbor Freight. It's not the best, but it gets the job done. This one, hopefully it's going to work today because it's been used a while, and the seal in the container here starts to go, and you don't get as good as suction. But basically this one, you're doing a reverse bleed. You're not touching the handle. You're filling it with fluid. You're pumping, keeping pressure in it, and it's just automatically going to suck the fluid through the line and drop it into the container. This makes life a lot easier. It makes it a lot faster. So this is what we're going to use today. Sometimes if I want to get the brakes a little bit tighter, I'll go with the other bleeder just to kind of finish it off. But after we get through it, I'm going to show you another little trick that helps. And usually if you have soft brakes, it's because there's an air bubble in the line. And this especially for the rear, because the rear ends up with a loop in it, so the bubble can get caught in that loop. So sometimes if I'm having issues with the rear, I'll actually remove the caliper and set it up on top, remove that loop, tap the line to get the bubbles to work up to the top, and then I'll bleed it that way. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes you get a good bleed. Obviously you need to make sure your calipers are in good condition, or otherwise if they're shot, if they're seized up or something, you're going to try to bleed forever and it's not going to work. So these are 450R calipers. The only other things you need, if you have 250R calipers, they take an 8mm socket or wrench for the brake valve. I recommend the wrench because it's easier to get in. If you have the bleeder on top, you need a wrench rather than a socket. Sometimes if they feel tight, I'll use a socket just to break them loose, but then switch over to your wrench. So the 450R uses a 10mm versus the 8mm, so that's what I have here. And then you want .4 brake fluid. Don't use .3. .4, and even the reservoir will say .4 brake fluid only. It doesn't heat up as quickly. You might even be able to use .5. I've never used .5. I'm not really sure the difference, to be honest. Maybe it has a higher temp rating. I don't know. So to get started, we want to take our reservoir cap off, and you don't need to. If you're using the pressure bleeder, you don't need to set it back on. It'll bleed through. And then you want to fill the reservoir. This method of bleeding with the pressure bleeder. Oh, and this always makes a mess. So I like to wrap a rag or a towel around the reservoir because I always end up dripping stuff down, and then I'll put two down below just to kind of keep things a little bit cleaner. So to start out, you want to make sure that reservoir is full. And this really helps with two people because the pressure bleeder pulls the fluid through so quickly that it's hard to keep up with, and you have to keep stopping and moving up, filling, stop, filling. So if you have two people, one guy can kind of just continuously feed in the fluid. So yeah, that's about it, and then we can get started. So with dual brake lines, or with, too much. See, leaked there already. Filled it too much. With dual brake lines or even the other ones, you want to start with one side. And you go one side, pull a bunch of fluid through, go to the other side, pull a bunch of fluid through, keep switching back and forth, and eventually, hopefully you get it to where you need to be. Now I've already loosened these up. So when you put the cap on the fitting, you should be able to, it should hold pressure. So when you yeah, see I'm losing pressure already. So I'm holding it on there, and now I'm at 22 psi. It's still leaking. I think this bleeder is kind of shot, so now I'm at 25. And then I take my wrench, just like you would normally bleed, open it up, and you should start seeing fluid coming through. You'll see bubbles, it'll do all kind of crazy stuff. So this I'm not getting a good seal, so I'm going to have to keep pumping it, which is a pain. A lot of times when you get it up to 25 psi, you can leave the fitting on there and just tighten it. It won't go down too many psi. This one is leaking. So I need to get a new pressure bleeder, and then you'll figure out the timing, how much you need to add. This is already halfway empty. So now I'll do it again. And normally with a new pressure bleeder, you don't have to keep pumping it. It'll hold the pressure. It'll only go down a few psi on each release. But this one is shot. So I have fluid coming out right now. Sometimes if it's going to keep doing that, I'll keep pumping it. Close it off. Check my level, I still have enough in there. They do have pressure bleeders that connect to a compressor, and I have one that I got off Amazon. It's kind of weird. I haven't even tried to use it yet. I need to figure it out, because that would probably make it nice. I can hear the air leaking out of that fitting. So it's just an annoying, tedious process. Fill, bleed, fill, bleed, fill, bleed. Seriously, my least favorite job on a build. But I will tell you, it is extremely important to get all the air bubbles out, because I had a situation when I first built my race bike. Apparently there was a bubble in the front brake lines. And it still had plenty of pressure on it. But what happened was that first practice I was in, after a couple laps, I came around a corner, and all of a sudden I got thrown off the bike. I had no idea what happened. I was by myself, just coming around the corner, and all of a sudden, boom, went flying off the bike. The bike rolled, and when I flipped it back over, obviously I was pretty dumbfounded on what happened. So I flipped it over, and then I went to roll it, and it wouldn't roll. And I was like, that's really weird. So for some reason, I grabbed the front brake, and it was rock solid, completely locked up. And that's because as the fluid heats up, that heat transfer goes to the bubble. The bubble expands and pressurizes the whole system. So not so big of an issue on the rear. If the rear locked up, I would just slide, but on the fronts, it's not good at all. And so I went back and re-bled all the brakes and got got that bubble out. It was fine after that, but obviously not something you want to mess with. So it's very important that you have good pressure on that lever and make sure all those bubbles are worked out of it. Sorry, so we're full there, and this is what's a pain when you don't get a good suction, because it takes its toll on your forearm. The other thing you want to do with these pressure bleeders, especially with this Harbor Freight one, I'm not doing it right now, I don't have enough fluid in there, but as the fluid will start to work up the line. It's actually starting now. So you want to keep the handle above the container. So I emptied the reservoir, and you can see all the fluid I'm pulling through. You can also see it working up the line here. And this has a pressure release, so if you press that, it'll drain all the fluid out of the upper line back into the container. Sometimes you can find a spot to set the container. Doesn't really work. And then keep the handle above, because if the fluid comes up into the handle, it'll start leaking all over, and then you're going to have a hard time getting any pressure out of it. So just keep that up. And all this fluid that you're pulling through, going into this container, is still good. So usually I have an extra container, an empty one I keep on hand, so that I can dump this back in, because it's all good fluid. You're just going to be pulling a lot through. You don't want to waste it and throw it away, because it's still clean. So I dump it. Once this gets full, you can either dump it back into this container, or if you have a separate container, however you want to do it, but don't waste the fluid, because it's still good. And you're gonna end up sucking a lot through, and shit, I've gone through an entire bottle trying to get brakes bled. That's when it really becomes a pain. Back to 25. This one's leaking really quickly, which sucks. Or another person, just two people doing this job is so much easier. Tons of air coming through. That's a combination of the fitting, the rubber fitting leaking on the metal fitting, and just air coming through the line. So that's the basic process, and I'm not going to finish this now because it's going to take too long. I'm going to have to get another one of these pumps tomorrow. But so you do that one side. You can see I'm already at 3/4 full on this container, and I have some on the floor and on my pants. It's inevitable. I've never figured out a good way to do this. So you just do that back and forth until you start to feel pressure on the lever. And then what you can do to make sure that you don't have any bubbles is start tapping the lines, because the bubbles get caught in the lines. So just, doesn't matter what you use, just tap it. That'll help release those bubbles and work them up to the top towards the reservoir. Do the same in the rear. If you're having an issue with the rear, even though it's a short line, that's when you take the caliper off, move it up, tap that line, get those bubbles to move up into the caliper, and then sometimes I just set it on the back of the quad and bleed it from there, because as you're putting pressure on it and stuff like that, it'll work that out. The last thing I do when I'm finished bleeding is another trick that sometimes helps, not always, but I zip tie my lever, especially in the fronts. I just zip tie it overnight. Tap all the lines. After you zip tie it, that'll bring all the bubbles up to the reservoir, and hopefully with the pressure in the system, it's going to help push those bubbles up all the way to the reservoir, and then it'll fill the lines up. So it's an annoying process. Obviously, it's something we have to do, but the pressure bleeder makes it much easier than using this other piece of crap that you're constantly pressing the lever or pressing the brake pedal. So I recommend doing that. If you can find one of these, like I said, the Harbor Freight one is okay, but it's not great. So I'll probably look for another one similar that maybe has some better fittings, and I don't know. But that's pretty much it. I think the tricks are, it doesn't matter what brake lines you run, both work. But if you are racing, I would recommend the dual line. Recreational, dunes, and all that stuff, you're not on your brakes as much, so you don't really, even recreational, you can run dual. But yeah, just go back and forth, bleed them out, keep adding fluid, and then zip tie that lever overnight, tap all the lines, let the bubbles come up, and hopefully that should get everything out of the system. And if you notice any leaking, especially from the rear master, then it needs a rebuild kit, new seals and stuff. I think that's about it. It's just one of those annoying processes. So I'll get this bled out, and the shock went out for this, the rear shock where it was leaking from the hose. So that's getting fixed right now. So hopefully we can get this thing wrapped up in the next week or two. Pretty much have everything else ready. The graphics are on, nerfs are on. I ground down the powder off the pro pegs, and those nerfs slid right on. Not like when I had them on the race bike and I had to beat them on, and dude, I was whacking the crap out of them to get them off. So these slid right on and off, which was nice. My skids came, my Pro Ballistic skids from Glenn Turner. I bought 2 of them. I have one for this and then one for the new race bike, the main race bike. So they'll be going on. I think that's about it. I did race yesterday, desert race, complete whiteout. Went over the bars, rolled the quad, just came up to a rock section. I was riding right behind second place, and I couldn't see for 12 miles. And luckily we had some breezes. It was clearing it out, but I had to keep backing off, then moving forward. And finally we came to this rock section. Dust cleared, and all of a sudden I had these 2 monster rocks in front of me. I locked up the brakes, slid, and kept going, but it was only a very narrow opening. I'd say probably 52, 53 inches. So when I came into it, it was too hot. The rear tire hit a small rock on the left, bounced the rear over, hit a 15-inch rock on the right, and the tire just climbed right up it and ejected me off the bike. So that sucked. Bent my roll stem. Probably only had 3 races on it too. I think it can be straightened though. But hey, that's desert racing. It's pretty gnarly, get gnarly out there. So that's it for now. I think that's kind of the last piece before the big reveal on this bike. So I'll probably do one other video with some quick tips and tricks, just some random stuff. And then after that, we'll get this thing completed and see how she rips. All right, guys, take it easy.